The city was in chaos. The sun was high in the sky, beating down on the cracked pavement as the sounds of tires screeching echoed through the air. A high-speed chase tore through the downtown streets, the roar of engines drowning out the chaos. Rebecca Lawson, the FBI chief, sat in the back of a secure vehicle, her eyes narrowed in concentration as her team raced to escape the unknown assailants tailing them. The windows of the vehicle were tinted, providing a sense of security, but Rebecca knew that wasn't going to last long. Suddenly, the world exploded in a deafening sound. A massive explosion rattled the streets, sending shockwaves through the air. The force of the blast sent Rebecca's vehicle careening out of control. The world seemed to slow down as the car veered off the road and crashed into a barricade, metal crumpling like paper. Flames erupted from the wreckage, spreading quickly, swallowing the car in an inferno. The bystanders who had been caught in the commotion stood frozen, their hands instinctively reaching for their phones, capturing the chaos for the world to see. Jamal Carter, a 14-year-old boy, was hiding in the shadows of an alley just a few blocks away. His clothes were ragged, his stomach growling, and his heart heavy with the weight of surviving another day on the streets. He had seen his share of chaos, of gunshots ringing out, of sirens blaring, and people fighting for a spot in the world. But nothing prepared him for the sight that met his eyes when he peeked around the corner. Rebecca Lawson, the FBI chief, was struggling to escape from the wreckage. Blood stained her uniform and her face contorted in pain. Her hands were shaking as she tried to undo her seatbelt, the flames licking at the sides of the vehicle. Jamal's breath hitched, but he didn't hesitate. He knew people like her wouldn't give him a second glance, but it didn't matter. Someone had to help. Without thinking, Jamal rushed forward. He ignored the fear gripping his chest, focused only on the woman trapped in the vehicle. He shoved his shoulder against the door, pushing with all the strength he had, until it finally gave way. His heart raced in his chest, but he kept his focus as he pulled her from the vehicle, the heat from the fire searing his skin. The crowd that had gathered began murmuring, the tension palpable in the air. Phones clicked, recording the scene, but nobody was stepping in to help. Jamal's hands were shaking, his arms aching, as he hoisted Rebecca, barely conscious, into his arms. "Help!" he shouted, looking desperately for someone, anyone, to step in. But the crowd stood back, watching with suspicion, their eyes filled with judgment. "Why is he touching her?" someone whispered. "What's a kid like him doing with a high-ranking officer?" Jamal's throat tightened, but he kept moving, refusing to leave her side. His eyes scanned the street, looking for a way to get her to safety, but it seemed like the world had turned against him in that moment. The crowd's whispers turned into low mutters, and Jamal could feel the weight of their eyes on him. "You're making a mistake," he muttered to himself, refusing to acknowledge their judgment. The only thing that mattered was that Rebecca was alive, and she was his responsibility now. As he struggled to move her away from the burning wreck, Jamal felt an overwhelming sense of hopelessness. The people who should have helped weren't. They watched him carry the officer through the crowd, not offering a hand, not speaking a word of comfort. All they did was stare at him, eyes full of suspicion. In his heart, he knew that even though he was saving her life, it didn't matter in their eyes. He was just a homeless black kid, a nobody who didn't belong. But none of that mattered. He kept walking, determined to get her to safety. The judgment in their eyes couldn't stop him now. With every step, Jamal's heart pounded harder, faster, but he didn't look back. The morning after the rescue, the apartment was eerily quiet. Jamal stayed by Rebecca's side as she slept, his mind racing. His grandmother, Miss Ruth, had treated Rebecca's wounds the best she could, using old remedies and care. As the hours dragged on, Jamal couldn't shake the feeling that he had done something wrong by taking her home instead of calling for help. But the streets were full of people who just stood by, and he couldn't leave her there to die. He watched over her the entire night, keeping an eye on her as she slept fitfully, the glow from the street lamps casting shadows on the walls. He wasn't sure what to expect when she woke up, or if anyone would even believe his story. He had seen the way people looked at him when he'd carried her to safety, judging, accusing. He knew he had no way of proving that he was just trying to help. When Rebecca finally stirred, her eyes fluttering open, Jamal let out a quiet breath of relief. He didn't know if she would remember him or understand why he'd brought her here, but he had to believe she was grateful. But the peace was short-lived. Suddenly, loud banging on the door shattered the silence. Jamal's heart skipped a beat, and Miss Ruth stood up quickly, looking confused. Before they could make sense of what was happening, the door crashed open. 2 officers stormed inside, their hands on their weapons, eyes scanning the small apartment. Jamal's chest tightened with fear. He didn't know what was going on, but the suspicion in their eyes was clear. "On the ground," one of the officers barked. Jamal didn't have time to react before he was pushed down onto the cold floor, his face smacking against the tiles. He felt hands yank his arms behind his back and the sharp click of handcuffs closing around his wrists. "What's going on?" Miss Ruth shouted, moving forward, but she was quickly held back. "Kidnapping!" The officer shouted, his voice full of accusation. This boy kidnapped a federal officer. Jamal's heart raced as he struggled to comprehend what was happening. He hadn't done anything wrong. He had just saved her. But none of that seemed to matter to the police. Rebecca, who had woken up to the chaos, sat up in the bed, her hand reaching out toward the officers. "Wait!" she shouted, her voice shaking with disbelief. "He didn't kidnap me. He saved my life. He helped me." The officers ignored her pleas, dragging Jamal to his feet and shoving him toward the door. "Let him go!" Miss Ruth cried, but no one listened. The officers were determined, their focus solely on Jamal, ignoring Rebecca completely. Jamal tried to look at Rebecca as they shoved him past her. His heart ached as he saw her face full of confusion and frustration. He hadn't wanted to cause trouble. He hadn't wanted to be a problem. All he wanted was to help. As the officers pushed him out the door, Jamal looked back at Miss Ruth, who was standing there, helpless. At the police station, Jamal was thrown into a holding cell, the door slamming shut behind him with a finality that made his stomach twist. His mind raced with thoughts of his mother, Miss Ruth, and Rebecca. He hadn't done anything wrong, so why was he being treated like a criminal? Hours passed, each minute heavier than the last. His stomach growled from hunger, and his hands ached from the cuffs. He thought about what had happened, how everything had spiraled out of control so quickly. One moment, he was a hero. The next, he was in chains. Finally, the door to his cell opened, and the harsh light from the hallway flickered over him. The officers who had arrested him stood in the doorway, but they weren't alone. Rebecca entered the room, her face stern but filled with concern. Jamal's heart lifted, but it was quickly replaced by anxiety. Would she understand? Would she be angry? "Jamal!" she exclaimed, rushing to the bars. "What is this? Why are you here?" The officers tried to stop her, but she ignored them, holding up her badge. "This boy saved my life. He didn't do anything wrong." "Ma'am, he's the one who— I don't care what you think happened," Rebecca interrupted, her voice calm but firm. He saved me. Let him go." The officers hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with being confronted by a federal officer. They exchanged glances, but Rebecca didn't wait for them to decide. "I want to speak to the captain now," she said, her voice leaving no room for argument. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with tension. Cameras flashed, reporters scribbled furiously in their notebooks, and spectators whispered under their breath as the trial of Jamal Carter unfolded before them. The public attention had been intense ever since the news broke that the kidnapped FBI chief had been saved by a young black boy. The twist of the story, the accusations against Jamal, had fueled a firestorm of controversy. Inside the courtroom, the prosecution wasted no time. The prosecutor, a tall, stern woman, stood at the podium, pointing directly at Jamal as she painted him as a criminal. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice laced with authority, "this young boy, Jamal Carter, knowingly took an unconscious federal agent, an officer of the law, and transported her to an undisclosed location. He took advantage of her vulnerability." Jamal sat in the defendant's chair, hands clenched in his lap, staring straight ahead. He couldn't even process what the prosecutor was saying. The truth was so simple. He hadn't done anything wrong. He'd only tried to help. But the more the prosecutor spoke, the more it felt like the whole world was against him. Go. The courtroom murmured in response as the prosecution continued, but it wasn't long before a familiar voice interrupted the tension. Rebecca Lawson, the FBI chief, walked to the witness stand with a sense of purpose. Her eyes locked with Jamal's, and for a moment, everything else in the room faded away. She stood tall, a commanding presence. Despite the overwhelming pressure of the moment, she began to speak with the conviction of someone who knew the truth. "Your Honor," Rebecca began, her voice strong but steady, "I am here today to tell you the truth. Jamal Carter did not kidnap me. He saved me. When my vehicle was attacked and I was left unconscious, Jamal found me. He carried me to safety when no one else would help. While others stood by, frozen in fear, Jamal acted." The courtroom was silent, every eye trained on Rebecca as she recounted the terrifying details of that night. She told them how, in the chaos of the crash, she had been trapped, unable to move, and how Jamal had dragged her from the wreckage, all while flames threatened to consume them both. She described how, despite the danger, Jamal's only thought had been to get her to safety. Rebecca turned to the jury, then to the judge. "Jamal didn't just save my life. He gave me a chance to go home to my family. He didn't take advantage of my vulnerability. He protected me when no one else would." The room was quiet, but a shift was taking place. It was clear that the public opinion was starting to change. Jamal wasn't the criminal the prosecution had painted him as. He was a hero. Rebecca's testimony was followed by video footage. Footage from bystanders and street cameras clearly showed Jamal carrying Rebecca from the wreckage, proving beyond a doubt that his actions were selfless and heroic, not criminal. The images were raw, unfiltered, and they spoke volumes. As the defense attorney reviewed the footage, it was clear there was no case against Jamal. He had done nothing but try to help someone in need. The courtroom was still as the judge pondered, but the truth was undeniable. A few moments later, the judge banged his gavel, signaling a decision. "The charges against Jamal Carter are hereby dropped," he declared. The courtroom erupted into murmurs of surprise and relief. Jamal, who had been tense with fear the entire time, suddenly felt the weight lift from his shoulders. Tears welled in his eyes as he looked at Rebecca, who gave him a small, reassuring smile. But outside the courtroom, the fight was far from over. The moment the verdict was released, social media erupted. Hashtags like #Justice for Jamal and #Racial Injustice flooded the internet. Public opinion turned quickly, and the injustice Jamal had suffered became a rallying cry for people all over the country. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse, chanting for justice. Signs were held high, calling out the system that had allowed racism and bias to dictate the lives of people like Jamal. News outlets covered the protests, showing images of people from all walks of life demanding change. In the midst of it all, Jamal was released from custody. The emotional scars would take longer to heal, but he walked out of that courtroom free. He was no longer just a boy accused of something he didn't do. He was a symbol of what could happen when people fought against injustice. It wasn't just a personal victory for Jamal, it was a victory for the many who had been wronged before him, a step toward changing the system that had failed so many. But as Jamal walked out into the daylight, the realization hit him. This battle wasn't over. But for the first time, he could see a glimmer of hope that things could change, one step at a time. The courtroom had finally emptied, but the weight of the day still lingered in the air. Jamal stood outside, his heart racing from the whirlwind of emotions. He was free, finally. The charges against him had been dropped, but the fight wasn't over. The injustice that had been inflicted on him was part of a much larger story. Rebecca, having taken the final steps to clear Jamal's name, walked up to him with a gentle expression. "You should know that this isn't just about you," she said, her voice steady but laced with regret. "I'm going to make sure the system works for you, for people like you." Jamal looked at her, unsure of what to say. He'd never been promised a future before, certainly not one like this. The life that had been given to him through sheer luck was too much for him to fully grasp in that moment. But he knew one thing. For the first time in his life, someone had seen him for who he truly was, a person deserving of respect, opportunity, and kindness. Rebecca continued, "You're going to have a chance to finish school. You'll never have to go back to the streets. I'll make sure of it." She paused, her expression hardening with the weight of her responsibility. "But I need you to trust me, Jamal. We're going to change your future together." Tears welled in Jamal's eyes as he looked at his grandmother, who had just arrived to see him. She approached him slowly, not fully able to believe the transformation that was taking place. She wiped her eyes before giving Rebecca a deep, appreciative look. "Thank you," she said, her voice quivering. "Thank you for giving my boy a chance." Rebecca nodded, her face softening at the woman's words. "He deserves it." "All of them do," she replied quietly, looking at the crowd that was now gathering outside the courthouse. She felt a knot in her stomach, realizing just how deep the need for change ran. A year later, Jamal stood in front of the massive FBI headquarters, his heart racing once more. But this time, it was different. Instead of the feeling of fear that had gripped him when he first entered that courtroom, it was the feeling of accomplishment and pride. He adjusted his tie, straightened his shoulders, and walked confidently through the doors. As he entered, a familiar face greeted him with a warm smile. Rebecca was there waiting for him. Her eyes sparkled with pride. "You did it, Jamal. You're here," she said, her voice a mixture of joy and relief. She guided him into the building, where the same officers who had once been part of the arresting force now saluted him, a silent acknowledgement of his transformation and their own. As they walked through the halls, Jamal took it all in. The same walls that had once felt intimidating now felt like a place of belonging. "I still can't believe it," he said, shaking his head in disbelief. Rebecca smiled. "Believe it, Jamal. This is your life now. This is where you belong." They reached an office, and Rebecca opened the door for him. "This is your desk," she said, motioning to a small but neatly arranged workspace. "Your future starts now." Jamal's heart swelled as he sat down in the chair. He thought about everything he'd been through, the unfairness of the system, and the way the world had looked at him. Now, he was in a position to change it, to make a difference, and he would. The final shot focused on Jamal's face as he sat behind the desk, his hands poised above the keyboard. A brief smile tugged at his lips as he looked at the plaque on the desk that read, FBI Intern. It wasn't just the beginning of his career. It was the beginning of a movement. The movement that would start with him and, with a little bit of luck and a lot of hard work, ripple out and change the world. And as the camera pulled back, the words flashed across the screen. Sometimes, a single act of kindness can change everything. Jamal's journey was just beginning, and it would continue to inspire others for years to come.